In 1945, France was starving. Bread was rationed, factories lay in ruins, and millions lacked homes. Yet within 30 years, this devastated nation would become a modern industrial superpower. The secret wasn't just American money. It was a calculated gamble on absolute state control. Demographer Jean Forestier coined the term Trente Glorieuses in 1979. He described a period from 1946 to 1975 of unprecedented growth. However, this transformation didn't begin with a miracle. It started in the ashes of a destroyed country. By 1945, France's infrastructure was shattered. Railways were bombed, ports destroyed, and bridges collapsed. Rationing continued until 1947 or 1948. A severe housing crisis left millions homeless. The country wasn't just damaged. Its entire economic structure was obsolete and bankrupt. Charles de Gaulle understood that simply rebuilding the past wouldn't suffice. In 1944, before France was fully liberated, he introduced a radical idea, dirigisme. The state would not just guide the economy. It would command it, direct it, and control its vital arteries. This was a profound ideological choice. While other nations leaned toward free markets, France chose centralized planning. The government decided which industries grew, where capital flowed, and which regions developed. It was a gamble that a bankrupt state could engineer prosperity. The first question was survival. The United States shipped 5 million tons of food to Europe between 1945 and 1946. That was 35 trillion calories, keeping 300 million people alive. But food was emergency relief, not a development strategy. France needed something more ambitious. That ambition came through the Marshall Plan, beginning in 1948. France received 18% of the total $3 billion distributed across 17 European nations. Yet here's the paradox. This aid accounted for barely 3% of national income, boosting GDP growth by less than 0.5%. So if American money wasn't the engine, what was? The answer lies in France's unique system of indicative planning. The government created 5-year plans targeting strategic sectors like steel, energy, and transport. Public banks funneled capital toward these priorities, regardless of short-term profitability. Key industries were nationalized. Banks, electricity, gas, coal, and major insurance companies came under state control. The government wasn't just a regulator. It became the dominant shareholder in France's economic future. This was dirigisme in practice, the state as architect, not spectator. The state had seized control of the economy. But how could a completely bankrupt government actually fund this massive reconstruction? The answer would come from an unexpected source. It would set France on a path that paradoxically led toward European market integration, not away from. France in 1946 was starving, but Charles de Gaulle had a radical blueprint. He didn't just want to rebuild, he wanted to dominate. The answer was dirigisme, a system where the state forcefully directed the entire national economy. The government introduced indicative planning to steer scarce resources into key industries. They targeted steel, electricity, and cement. Bureaucrats didn't own the factories, but they controlled the money. If you aligned with the plan, you got funded. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Between 1947 and 1973, France enjoyed an average annual GDP growth rate of 5%. This wasn't just a recovery. It was an economic explosion that outpaced centuries of prior industrial progress. But how did they ignite this economic fire so fast? The initial recovery phase was driven by sheer exhaustion. Productivity gains and massively increased working hours squeezed every drop of output from a battered French workforce. Rationing still gripped the nation until 1948, and a severe housing crisis left millions homeless. Yet, the workers endured the hardship. They were fueled by the promise that their immense sacrifices would soon translate into unprecedented national prosperity. Share your thoughts below on whether this heavy-handed state control was necessary for survival or a recipe for stagnation. The state's grip was tightening, but the early economic numbers were absolutely undeniable. By 1950, the invisible revolution was accelerating. Over the next 25 years, the real purchasing power of the average French worker would skyrocket by 170%. The state secured social peace through rising wages. Simultaneously, a massive demographic boom transformed the market. A high birth rate and declining mortality reversed decades of stagnant population growth. France suddenly had millions of new consumers demanding cars, appliances, and modern homes. To feed this soaring domestic demand, the state poured concrete. Massive infrastructure projects rapidly reshaped the landscape. New dams, railways, and factories sprang up, creating a modern industrial superpower from the ashes of a ruined nation. But this rapid modernization had a voracious industrial appetite. The domestic plan was working beautifully, but France couldn't produce everything alone. They desperately needed a larger European market to absorb their output and secure vital raw materials. Yet, securing these materials required capital and cooperation. France looked beyond its borders for a solution. The entire future of modern European economics was about to be completely rewritten. What do you think was the most daring gamble in this economic transformation? In 1945, Europe was starving. The United States shipped 5 million tons of food across the Atlantic, delivering 35 trillion calories to a devastated continent. That was enough to feed 300 million people for 100 calories a day for an entire year. Survival came first. Reconstruction would come later. France alone received 18% of all Marshall Plan aid, roughly $4 billion at the time. The money flowed in between 1948 and 1951, targeted at rebuilding shattered infrastructure and jump-starting dormant industries. On paper, it looked like the lifeline that would rescue the French economy, but the numbers tell a more complicated story. Marshall Plan aid accounted for only about 3% of France's national income during those years. Economists estimate the direct boost to GDP growth at less than 0.5%. The financial impact was surprisingly small, almost negligible. So why do we still call it a miracle? The truth is that American aid acted more as a psychological catalyst than a financial engine. It unlocked confidence, restored credit, and gave French planners breathing room to execute a much bigger strategy already in motion. Remember, Charles de Gaulle had introduced dirigisme back in 1944, before the war even ended. State-directed economic planning was already shaping Reconstruction. The Marshall Plan didn't create France's recovery framework. It simply filled gaps within a system the French government had designed independently. Share your perspective below on whether the Marshall Plan saved post-war Europe, or if history exaggerated its role. Meanwhile, rationing in France continued until 1947, and a brutal housing crisis left millions without proper shelter. The suffering was real. Families queued for bread tickets while entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Yet behind this visible misery, something invisible was happening. French factories were modernizing at breakneck speed, adopting American productivity methods and retooling for mass production on an unprecedented scale. Between 1947 and 1973, the French economy grew at an average annual rate of 5%. Real purchasing power of workers surged by 170%. These staggering numbers cannot be explained by two. $4 billion in American aid spread across 4 years. Something else was driving this explosion. The Marshall Plan provided tools and temporary relief, but the engine of growth was French. State planners, indicative planning commissions, and a relentless push for industrial modernization were doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. But how long could this state-led miracle truly last? But if the Marshall Plan's direct financial impact was so small, what actually fueled the unprecedented explosion in French industrial capacity? The answer lies in a controversial system of government control that would reshape France and the entire European continent. By 1951, France's state planners needed vast quantities of coal and steel to fuel reconstruction, but domestic output struggled to meet soaring demand. How could a dirigiste economy sustain its massive industrial plans without securing these vital raw materials? The answer arrived through a calculated gamble. In 1951, France joined the European Coal and Steel Community, known as the Mountain Union. This alliance allowed supranational decisions on coal and steel trade, breaking centuries of protectionist barriers to secure vital resources. Here lies the great paradox of the Trente Glorieuses. At home, Paris enforced heavy state intervention and strict economic planning. Yet abroad, France championed a gradual move toward market competition, dismantling tariffs to feed its nationalized industries. Why would a government obsessed with central control willingly surrender sovereignty over its most critical sectors? Because the Mountain Union increased efficiency and prosperity, ensuring French factories had the heavy materials required to sustain rapid growth. This booming economy forged an industrial superpower from the ashes of war. For those fascinated by how nations engineer lasting prosperity, the patterns emerging here reveal lessons still relevant today. But what happens when a starving, war-torn nation suddenly becomes wealthy? The population exploded. France experienced rapid growth driven by a high birth rate and declining mortality, contrasting sharply with its stagnant demographics of the previous century. This demographic shift demanded an entirely new standard of living. The real purchasing power of the average French worker's salary rose by 170% between 1950 and 1975. Suddenly, citizens expected modern housing, cars, and consumer goods. The state had to deliver on these soaring expectations, or face severe social unrest. Paris poured resources into nationalized industries, betting that centralized planning could satisfy the explosive new demands of a rapidly modernizing society. Rationing was finally ending by 1948. But a severe housing crisis compounded the difficulties of a rapidly growing population. The government launched massive construction projects, shifting from survival mode to building a modern consumer society. The invisible revolution was working. Yet, as French citizens tasted prosperity, the cracks in the dirigiste system began to show. Could centralized planning survive the explosive rise of consumer demands, or would market forces eventually destroy it? But this invisible revolution of wealth and heavy state control was building a hidden vulnerability that would abruptly end the miracle. The French worker, however, was living through an unprecedented golden age of prosperity that seemed unstoppable. This demographic explosion created a young, dynamic workforce. A high birth rate and declining mortality reversed the stagnant population trends of the previous century, giving French factories the labor needed to power an unprecedented industrial expansion. Subscribe to explore more pivotal moments in French industrial history. The economy surged at an average annual rate of 5%. Productivity soared as new technologies and industrial planning transformed the country. Workers stood at the center of this boom, driving the factories and rebuilding the nation. Between 1950 and 1975, the real purchasing power of the average French worker's salary rose by an astonishing 170%. This meant refrigerators, cars, and vacations, once unimaginable luxuries, became everyday realities for millions of families across France. In 1979, demographer Jean Forestier looked back and coined the term Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. He borrowed the name from the 3 glorious days of the 1830 revolution. But the transformation he witnessed was far more profound. Before the war, France had been a nation of slow growth, its population aging and its economy stagnant. The Trente Glorieuses shattered that old world. It created a new social contract where the state guaranteed rising living standards. New housing estates rose on the outskirts of cities, and the car became a symbol of freedom. The housing crisis that had paralyzed the immediate post-war years was finally being solved. The government invested heavily in modern infrastructure. This prosperity was not a product of free markets alone. It was driven by dirigisme, the state's heavy hand directing investment, planning production, and controlling key industries. The worker benefited, but the system was building a fragile dependency. The entire edifice of the Trente Glorieuses rested on a delicate balance: high state spending, protected markets, and rising wages. But as the 1970s approached, the first cracks were appearing. Inflation and global competition tested the model. The invisible revolution had delivered unimaginable wealth, but it had also planted the seeds of its own destruction. The golden age of the French worker was about to crash into a wall no planner had foreseen. In 1973, the world changed overnight. Arab oil producers embargoed the West, sending energy prices soaring. For France, which had built its industrial revival on cheap oil, the shock was not a slowdown. It was a wall. The numbers tell the story. France's economy had grown at an average of 5% annually for over 2 decades. Now, growth collapsed. The system that relied on cheap energy and heavy state planning buckled under pressures nobody had anticipated. But why did the miracle end so abruptly? The answer lies in a paradox. The very state control that had rescued France now became a constraint. Dirigisme excelled at rebuilding from ruins but struggled to adapt to a volatile global economy. Yet the legacy was enormous. By 1975, French workers' real purchasing power had risen 170% since 1950. France had a highly developed welfare state, modern infrastructure, and industries that ranked among the world's best. Here is the question that still divides economists today. Was it dirigisme, the bold state planning that drove 3 decades of spectacular growth? Or was it market liberalization, European integration, and the natural catch-up of a devastated economy? Forestier documented this as an invisible revolution, spanning 1946 to 1975. He saw a society that had reinvented itself completely, from rural poverty to modern prosperity. No war or revolution before had changed France so deeply, so quickly. The very state control that saved France eventually had to adapt to the market. The Trente Glorieuses left behind a modern welfare state and a historical enigma. It left a question that still shapes economic policy across Europe today. From starvation to superpower in 30 years, France's gamble on dirigisme remains one of history's great economic experiments. If you want to see how another nation took a different path to prosperity, watch our next video on post-war Germany's economic miracle.